Hello! I'm Elaine, and I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter. I do ghost tours. And I am not going to tell you the stories that I tell on my tour, because you gotta pay for those. But if you want to hear some interesting things that have happened to me while I'm leading random drunk people around the French Quarter, I got you.
So tonight was one of those nights that I did have some problems on my tour, but they were the best kind of problems to have, mostly. So there was a group on my tour that were a little bit close to the verge of too drunk, but they were just the kind that chatted a little bit too much, not really a real problem. It was only when I was talking to them one on one that was like, oh, babies, y'all have had too much. But the big problem of my tour was a guest who had all the questions in the known universe. And this is a great problem to have. And I will admit some of his questions were a little bit way too nuanced for a tour. Well, the first one was at the end of the rules, he asked me if I'd ever been to the Poe Tavern in Charleston. And I'm like, no, and it took me a moment to realize that he was asking this because I was wearing a shirt that has Edgar Allan Poe on it. But I was just sort of like, dude, not really apropos of the moment, but sure, we'll talk about that for a second. And then after the first story, he asked me about where in Africa the enslaved people in New Orleans were from. And I'm sitting here like, mostly Western Africa. And he's like, yeah, but which country? And he started just naming African countries. And I'm like, baby, all of them. And also, like, a lot of those country lines are new ish things. Like, not really this most useful information for the time. And he was like, okay, well, but what about where were the Europeans that brought them over? Were they French? Were they English? And I'm like, a little from column A, a little from column B, but also everybody else too. Originally it was France, but the slave trade involved people from a lot of different nations, including the Dutch. And he was like, no, the Dutch didn't have a culture of enslavement. I'm like, yes, they did. He was like, but they didn't have colonies. I'm like, yes, they did. And he was like, but I haven't heard about that. And I was like, well, they did, but also, like, a lot of them were just merchants who would go to Africa and, like, be like, hey, we'll trade you guns for people. But that was all just way too nuanced. When I'm sitting here like, guys, this is like the first stop. I have so many more stories to tell you, and time is burning. And also, that stop was a little bit delayed because in the middle of it, there was just a random person screaming as you do. And like it was just across the street, so I was trying to ignore it, but I could see all of my guests turning to watch this person shouting obscenities across the street. And the first stop is at Rampart Street, so across the street involves 4 lanes of quick moving traffic and the streetcar line. So there's plenty of room between us and them. And I'm just trying to talk over it, and they are all turning to watch. And I'm sitting here like, guys. But luckily, I was right at the point of my story where I'm talking about the mafia and talk about how the mafia does not go away if you ignore it. So I just worked it into my story. I was like, yes, there are many things you can ignore and they'll go away, like random people screaming across the street, but the mafia is not one of them. But yeah, so the tour was already running pretty late by the time we made it to like the third stop. And then he wants to know about the fact that Marie Laveau was born free. And he was like, but she was a black woman. I'm like, yeah, there were free people of color. And he was like, but how? And I'm sitting here like, baby, okay, let's do this. Yes, there were a lot of free people of color in New Orleans in the 1800s. Some of them actually came here free. Some of them were, descendants of people who were brought here as enslaved and were freed. Manumission was actually pretty-ish common during the Spanish era and a little bit during the French era too. And then I had to explain what manumission was. And then that kept going for a while before I was like, okay, we got to go to the next stop. And it was like this at every stop. Every stop, he had really good, in depth, like nuanced questions. And I'm so happy for that because that means that somebody cares. That means somebody is really listening. Now, I will admit, a couple of the questions he had proved that he was not fully listening to my stories, but I also understand people get distracted. It happens. And I just really like it when people, want to know more. But at the same time, I do have a time limit, so there's a limit of how much more I can give you.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to share your own experiences in the comments below.